So yesterday we had we were talking about workers who are already at the job, and it's time to recite the Kriya Shema. And as a result, they have to recite Kriya Shema, but they're up in a tree or they're at the construction site. So the Mishnah had said that we don't require them to come down the tree for Kriya Shema, but we do require them to come down the tree for Shemona Esrei, for Tefillah. And then the last thing that we saw yesterday is that that's only true if they're up in a regular tree. But if they're up in an olive tree or a fig tree, um, they can daven Shemona Esrei up there. And the reason is because it's a very laborious process to go up and down the tree. And so Chazal were lenient that even though it's difficult to have kavana while you're up in a tree, nonetheless, they made this one dispensation for these kinds of workers. Okay, so the brisa now that we're going to see today is a similar issue, which is about carrying a load while you want to daven. We know that one of the halachos is that's brought down in Shulchan Aruch is that while you're davening, you're not allowed to be holding anything in your hands because when you're holding things in your hands, it could be very distracting. It's hard to concentrate when you've got, let's say, a hand grenade without the pin, you know. Okay, it's going to be hard to daven. Or even something that's fragile, you know, let's say you're holding a mug or something like that, or a cup of coffee. You're not allowed to be holding anything like that when you're davening because it's distracting. The only thing you are allowed to hold when you're davening is a sitter, right? That's the only exception.
Reminds me of the story about the two guys who were smoking, and they wanted to smoke while they were davening. So first guy goes into the Rebbe and says, and comes back, he says, no, we're not allowed to. He says, what'd you ask him? I asked him, can we smoke while we're davening? So he went, can we smoke while we're davening? So the other guy went and asked, he says, can we daven while we're smoking? And the Rebbe said, yeah, fine.
Yeah.
Questions of like Robinson?
No.
Yeah.
Right,
Okay.
It's that exclusive to your hands, but not on your back, like a backpack.
Right. So now the other question is, what about carrying a backpack or any other load? People, yeah, you're a soldier or you're a laborer, and your part of your job is to schlep stuff, and you want to recite the Shema or you want to daven. So Tane Hakataf, a carrier, which could be a water carrier, Tevya, milkman, you know, Afal Pi Shemasao al Ksefo Hareza Koreas Shema. He says, even though he's got his burden on his shoulders, he's nonetheless allowed to recite the Kriya Shema. Even the first pasuk, it seems, right? He would have to stop walking, but he doesn't have to remove the burden off of his shoulders. Avol lo yaschil lo b'shashu porek v'lo b'shashu toein mipnei she'in libo miyushav. But what you're not allowed to do is start reciting the Shema, the first pasuk of Shema, which is the one that requires the kavana. You cannot be doing that when you are in the midst of either putting the pack on or taking the pack off. So while you have the pack on and everything is stable, so then you could even recite the first pasuk of Kriya Shema with the thing on your back. Now, that's only about Kriya Shema, but with Shemona Esrei, we'll see that the poskim are more machmir with Shemona Esrei. Vein kach uvein kach, yeah, this is either way. Al yispalel ad sha'a sheyifro. You cannot say Shemona Esrei until you remove the load off of yourself. The imhaya alav masoy shel arbas kabin mutter. But as long as the weight is less than 4 kavs, so then it's okay, even to daven Shemona Esrei while the thing is on your back. Now, how much is the weight of 4 kavs? It's got to be less than 4 kavs. So he brings down that from the Rambam, it's about 5 kilograms, which about 5 kilos, yeah. So there are other opinions that it's more than 5 kilos, but that would be, I guess, and again, we don't necessarily paskin this way. So, we'd have to look up the halacha. But in general, you're not supposed to be holding anything while you're davening Shemona Esrei. Now, so let's get a further clarification on this halacha. Amar Rabbi Yonasan v'hu sheshikel. That's only provided that you properly weighted it. What does that mean that you properly weighted it? Mahu sheshikel, what does that mean? Train chelkin lechoroye v'chad lekamoye. That you distribute evenly the weight of the thing so that it's not overly distracting, which means, and I guess the way that they used to schlep stuff, 2/3 of the weight is behind you and 1/3 of the weight is in front of you. I don't know if this is a rule of thumb or not. I'm not sure where they get this idea that 2/3 has to be behind you and 1/3 is in front of you. I guess that was the way that they measured what's the best way for people to schlep things. I would have normally thought it would be 50% in the back and 50% in front, but that's not apparently, that's
The back muscles are
the
stronger.
back muscles are stronger. Really? So that's the reason, huh?
Your backpack forever, but can't carry it in front of you.
Interesting. Okay, so it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Tane, so now we have another brisa, which doesn't talk about schlepping or carrying things, but it does talk about distracting things. Lo yehi merames be'enav v'koreh. You're not allowed to be making motions with your eyes while you're in the middle of Kriya Shema. So it's unclear as far as at what point of Kriya Shema, because up until now we've only been talking about the first pasuk of Shema, but this halacha seems to extend throughout the Shema, and so the poskim discuss whether it applies to the whole Shema, whether all 3 paragraphs or only the first paragraph. But apparently, if we want to make it consistent with what we've said up until now, you're not supposed to do any distracting activity during the Shema, because if you're making motions with your eyes, and this is brought down in the Talmud Bavli as well in Maseches Yoma, that it says that you're not shelo yikrotz bisvasa v'lo yora be'etzba'osa, that you're not supposed to make motions with other parts of your body. Let's say with your mouth, let's say you see your little boy chick walks in and you want to give him a little kiss, right? Or you want to mouth certain words, right? You can't do that when you're in the middle of Kriya Shema. Or you want to point with your finger, or make a motion.
So why did the Brisa mention Be'enav?
So the Brisa only gives that as example, but the Gemara in Yoma says there are other examples as well.
What if we're just looking up and seeing somebody walk by you? Like, is that the same thing?
That there's nothing wrong because you're not doing anything proactive. You're just passively looking, right? But to specifically make motions while you're in the middle of Kriya Shema is not permitted, and certainly that's not permitted during Shemona Esrei. It does get a little comical when you see some people davening Shemona Esrei and they're supposed to be having kavana, and they're shuckling and they're davening with the talis on the head, and everything is very, very intense. And then all of a sudden, he starts pointing and and people do business while in the middle of the Shemona Esrei. It's like they do barters and exchanges, right? So
Story of Yosef when he met Yaakov, when Yaakov came down to Egypt, and it says that he kissed Yaakov, but Yaakov didn't speak to Yosef.
because he was reciting Kriya Shema. Yeah, interesting. Okay.
Going back to the 2/3 distribution, just looked up if the fireman's lift. So
What is a fireman's lift?
the way you're supposed to carry a
body.
a body.
Yeah.
Maybe they got this from this because it says the distribution is like 70%. in the back, which is roughly.
No kidding.
2/3.
Yeah, that's roughly 2/3.
I just made another example of like, the incredible intelligence and knowledge that is contained here.
Yes, yes. Well, listen, remember, in the ancient world, they knew a lot of things that we take for granted, and a lot of things they knew that we've forgotten and that we've had to rediscover. You know, like all of a sudden, someone will tell you, "Oh, the firemen did studies. It took them 3 years. They did it at Princeton. They did a whole study of the distribution of weight, and they came up with this." Well, they knew about this 3,000 years ago, also. Yeah, but
But if they took
right.
that kind of study to learn it now, they didn't have that kind of research back then. Maybe a lot of that knowledge came from the Gemara.
It could have come from the Gemara. It could have come from the Babylonians or from the Assyrians or the Sumerians, for all we know. It's very important. Like I don't mean to burst any bubble, right? But the fact that you find it in the Gemara, you find scientific data, doesn't necessarily mean it was innovated by Chazal. They had access to the science of their day also, and the medicine of their day. And that also helps to appreciate the fact that when you find certain remedies found in the Gemara that seem ridiculous, it's also important to put that in the context as well. They were working with whatever scientific information they had at the time. So a lot of times they had very reliable scientific data, like the people were doing autopsies in the ancient world also, so they knew about the anatomy and they knew about a weight distribution and things like that through trial and error, right? So, bloodletting, the jury is still out. It was, until I guess the 20th century, where we don't find it to be therapeutic anymore. But who knows? Maybe in 5 years from now, they'll discover that bloodletting is actually good for you. Who knows? Okay. So, we have another brisa that says, Hapoalin shahayu osin malacha etzel balabayis, hare elu mevarchim bracha rishona. So now we're going to talk about lunch break. So when you have workers who are eating together with the balabayis, with their employer, we know, there was no such thing as unions and there was no such thing as an hour lunch break. There's no entitlement in halacha to take an hour for lunch, right? So you're only allowed to take off the time that you need in order to eat, but or breakfast, whatever the meal that they would have with their employer, but they're not allowed to take extra time. So what does that mean? That means that we have an obligation to reduce the time that it takes us to say Birkas Hamazon, because Birkas Hamazon is a biblical obligation. But the obligation to say it in its current format is rabbinic, meaning that we know that the Gemara in Berachos and the Bavli talks all about the 3 topics that you must cover in order to fulfill your biblical obligation of Birkas Hamazon. You have to say Al Haaretz, the Al Hamazon, and you have to make mention of Yerushalmi. And so hopefully we'll get into that at some point in the Yerushalmi as well. But what we're going to see here is that you're allowed to abridge the Birkas Hamazon in order to go back to work as quickly as possible. So how did they do this? Harei elu mevarchem bracha rishona. They would say the first blessing of Birkas Hamazon, Hazanas Hakol, v'kol shel Yerushalayim v'shel Eretz. And then they would abridge the second and third blessings, which is Nodelecha and Ve'al Hakol, and they would put those 2 together, V'chosmin V'shel Eretz, and then they would say the end of that bracha that was combined of the 2, and they would say Al Haaretz Ve'al Hamazon. Now, aval im hayu osim imo b'seudan, but if they're working in exchange for food, meaning they're not getting salaries, they're just working for food. So then oshahaya balabayis ochel imohen, or if the balabayis is eating with them, hare elu mevorchim arba. then they say the full 4 blessings of Birkas Hamazon. So when the Balabais is not eating with them and there's a certain urgency for them to get back to work as quickly as possible, they say only 2 brachos, the first regular bracha of Birkas Hamazon, and then they combine the second and third together, and they completely omit the 4th bracha, which is Hatov HaMeitiv, because that's rabbinic in origin. But that's only when they're not eating with the Balabayas, and it's only when they're not getting paid with food. But if their whole salary, if their whole wages is the food itself, we are more lenient with them, and that we tell them to say all 4 blessings.
What's the local mice on that today?
That's a good question. We'll have to take a look. So anyway, we've got to hold it here for today because it's Rosh Chodesh. So you will have a wonderful day, a good davening, and a good Elul.
Anybody drink?
Chodesh Tov. Chodesh Tov. Don't make motions.
What happens in the middle of Shmor Esrei that somebody